Good morning, sir.
Yeah, good morning. Good morning.
Welcome to the national webinar, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, I feel highly privileged to welcome you all to this two-day national webinar on Sri Aurobindo, the poet and the nationalist, on the significant occasion of Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. On behalf of the Departments of English, SRR Government Arts and Science College, Autonomous Karimnagar, and ABB Government Degree College, Janagaon. Sir, now I welcome Dr. K. Ramakrishna Garu, our principal, to preside over the function. Now I welcome the chief guest, our commissioner, sir, Naveen Mittal Garu, and Narsaya Garu, principal, ABV Government Degree College, to be the guest of honor of the webinar. Sir, please give me a minute to explain the theme and objectives of the webinar, sir. Our main aim is to pay homage to Sri Aurobindo on the occasion of this sesquicentennial, that is 150th birth anniversary celebrations. Born into an educated Bengali family on 15th August 1872, as Aurobindo Ghosh, he blossomed into Sri Aurobindo, a yogi and guru of the entire world. He was a shrewd student, high-profile officer of Baroda government. Sir, once again, and I welcome one and all. Now I request Dr. K. Ramakrishna Garu to talk a few minutes, 2 minutes as president of the webinar.
Very good morning. Good morning all. I warmly welcome to Honorable Esteemed Commissioner, sir. It is a great occasion with pleasure and elation. I, myself on behalf of SRR staff and students, a warm welcome to you, sir. Our beloved esteemed Commissioner, sir, a dynamic visionary leader, entire college education going very fastly growth. On behalf of our English faculty and students, I once again warmly welcome to you, sir. At the outset, I appreciate Department of English of SRR Government Arts and Science College organizing this webinar to commemorate Sri Aurobindo as a part of Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. What more can be done befitting on this occasion than paying homage to versatile genius, a philosopher, a great scholar, yogi, Maharshi, poet, nationalist. He was also journalist. He was a nationalist leader until 1910, a spiritual reformer also. His visions on human progress and spiritual evolution is inspiring always. Words fall short to explain the exceptional genius of Sri Aurobindo ji. His sojourn in England helped him to learn English, Greek, German language. It is said that by the turn of the century, he was well versed in more than 12 languages. He engaged in national movement and wrote articles championing the cause of freedom. His spiritual journey began in Puducherry. As a yogi, he wrote books such as The Synthesis of Yoga, The Secret of Veda and Upanishads, Letters on Yoga, explains the ideology of Sri Aurobindo ji. The epic poem Savitri is considered as his magnum opus work. His spiritual concepts are being disseminated across the world by Sri Aurobindo Ashram Puducherry, thus enlightening the minds in search of knowledge. My best wishes to GDC Janagaon principal and faculty also. I once again warm welcome to Honorable Esteemed Commissioner, sir, for in his hectic schedule, sir, given precious time to us. I hope the participants will gain the insights into Sri Aurobindo philosophy and the knowledge of his integral yoga in this two-day national webinar from the eminent speakers. Thank you, one and all. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your message. And now I request Dr. Narsaya Garu to present his views as guest of honor to this webinar.
Today, we are assembled and attend this function. The Honorable Commissioner of College of Education, Sri Naveen Mittal, IAS Garu, to welcome to this function, and our English department faculty, and I appreciate to conduct this function, this webinar, and to all the students and staff members. I welcome to attend this function. Sir, today topic is a tribute on the occasion of 158th birth anniversary celebration Sri Aurobindo, the poet, and the tribute Sri Aurobindo Ghosh is one of the Indian most famous figures. He was an Indian nationalist poet, philosopher, yogi, and teacher. He was the one who proposed the idea of university extension and the earth as a result of spiritual growth. The central theme of Aurobindo's vision was the evolution of human life into the divine. He wrote, "Man is a transitional being. He is not final. This step from man who Superman is the next approaching achievement in the earth evolution." Thus, Aurobindo created a dielectric mode of salvation not only for the individual but all dialectical mode in mankind. This his father sent him to England to complete his studies. There he learned various foreign languages like Greek, French, Italian, German, Latin, and Spanish. In 1892, he came back to India and actively participated in freedom struggle. He was arrested for conscription on May 1st, 1908 and released after 1 year. After 1 year solitary confinement, he recorded his spiritual experiences in April aeroplane that in the book Tales of Prison Life. He devoted himself for the rest of his life to the development of integral yoga.
Thank you, sir.
Heartfully thankful to Honorable Commissioner to the attend this function and all faculties and principal of SRR College, Sri Ramakrishna Garu, and myself. I am Dr. A. Narsaya, Principal, GDC, Jangam.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Right, madam.
Now, I welcome Dr. S.V. Kumar Garu to present the profile of our beloved Commissioner, sir, Dr. Naveen Mittal Garu.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, participants. At the outset, I deem it my privilege to present the profile of our beloved Commissioner, Sri Naveen Mittal, sir. And also on behalf of the Department of English and SRR Government Arts and Science College, I extend warm welcome to this two-day national level webinar on Sri Aurobindo. Sri Naveen Mittal, Commissioner of Technical and Collegiate Education, Government of Telangana, belongs to the 1996 batch of the Indian Administrative Services, and he was allotted to the Telangana cadre in 2014. He is a BTech in Computer Science and Engineering from the Indian Institute of Technology in New Delhi. Throughout his 24-year-long career as an administrator at the helm of affairs, he has held diverse posts, including that of Commissioner of Visakhapatnam Municipal Corporation, Collector of Krishna and Hyderabad Districts, Special Commissioner in Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation, Commissioner of Information and Public Relations, Secretary of Finance and later Municipal Administration and Urban Development in the state of Telangana, and has significantly contributed to reforming and re-engineering systems and processes wherever he has worked. During his tenure as Commissioner of Collegiate Education and Technical Education, that is during the last 4 years and 4 months, he has worked in transforming the higher education system in the state of Telangana. His efforts in modernizing and reorganizing the courses in government colleges has led to an unprecedented 43% of growth in student admissions across GDCs in the state of Telangana. He has also helped revise the curriculum, making soft skills and employability skills an integral part of the curriculum. Sir's impact is very much visible both in the fields of administration and academics. For example, during the last 4 years, he has pushed 3 colleges for getting autonomy, including our esteemed, senior SRR Government Arts and Science College. And I hope, sir, many more colleges would get autonomy under your administrative acumenship. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for enlightening us on achievements of our Commissioner, sir. Now I request and wholeheartedly welcome our Commissioner, sir, to give his keynote address. Welcome, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. First of all, I must congratulate both these colleges, both the SSR Government Arts and Science College of Karimnagar as well as the College of Jangaon. The 2 colleges have got together to organize this 2-day conference and seminar, I would say, on a very important topic, which is the life of Aurobindo, whose 150th birth anniversary we are celebrating this year. I must compliment the departments of English of both these colleges who have joined together to organize this seminar. In fact, it's very interesting that the birth date of Shri Aurobindo falls on the day of independence of India. He was born on the 15th of August of 1872, and this 15th August will be 150 years of his birth. And India also became independent on 15th of August 1947, and we are celebrating 75 years of Indian freedom. So that's very, I would say, very remarkable time that as we are celebrating our Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, that is the 75th year of India's freedom, we are also celebrating 150th year of Shri Aurobindo. And that's, I would say, a great occasion which you, both these colleges have remembered and are organizing this workshop. And I think the Department of English is doing well to integrate such topics into teaching of English. In fact, in the state of Telangana, it has been our endeavor, I would say, in last about 3 years back, when we were looking at transforming our curriculum in the state of Telangana. We went deep into the subject of English and how it is being taught. And we found that it was not helping the needs of the student in the state, because a lot of things and a lot of way in which it was being taught was very archaic. And that's when we got together, the University Board of Studies as well as the Council of Higher Education and the Commissioner of Collegiate Education got together to revise the curriculum to meet the needs of students and make them much more employable. So the English program has become now more of a communication program, which we all felt is the need of the hour, and especially for students of science and students of commerce, for whom English is very important for doing well when they enter into the job market. I think we are now able to serve the needs. And we have also been able to integrate some very interesting topics into the English curriculum, one of which is the gender studies, as well as human value and ethics. And that has really helped to touch the core of our students in two very important ways. One is in terms of basic human values and ethics, and also gender equality, which is, I would say, very, very primary requirement for society to do well. And both these departments of the two colleges have got together to organize this conference. I must say, will really help these students to understand the life of Shri Aurobindo and his contribution to the Indian freedom struggle, as well as the Indian society, very well, I would say, and also help them to get more proficient in English language also. And I think this combination of the two aims is, I would say, very noteworthy, and really requires commendation to both the departments and the faculty involved in these colleges. And I'm sure that students will really derive benefit out of it. As the speakers before me have said, and I think 2 days we're going to talk about the life of Shri Aurobindo. I can say that I had the fortune of visiting Shri Aurobindo Ashram in Auroville in Pondicherry sometime when I was a student in the year 94. I was actually doing my summer training in Bangalore, and I was able to travel to Shri Aurobindo Ashram at that time. And I can confidently tell you that he's an ideal example of a person whose life is, I would say, an inspiration, because he started from qualifying in the written exam of Indian Civil Services, and then left it to join the Baroda Civil Services, because he felt that he will be able to contribute more to the people of India in a more independent way. And then he actually then went and participated in the Indian freedom struggle and contributed in very big ways. And finally, when he was imprisoned, he developed these deep spiritual insights, which are I would say a path and a way forward for millions and millions of people. In fact, a few things which I can recall, especially reading about Shri Aurobindo, are basically that the two major contributions which have made is one is this concept of integral yoga, and the two is the evolution of human mind. And he has married the best of the, I would say, the Indian spiritual thought process with also the modern thought process of the West, which I think is even today, I would say, is the need of the hour, because we have to be rooted in our strength, which is our deep spiritual thought, which is there in India, as well as the progressive mindset of the West, because one without the other, I think, is a recipe for disaster. And we've been seeing all around the world that simple, one-minded quest for growth or for economic development leads to disaster, and we've seen this happening in many Western societies. And not progressing with times also doesn't take you anywhere. I mean, it is also a recipe for loss of freedom. And I think this is something which he really brought out very well. And also this evolution of a human mind, wherein he talked about the outer being, the inner being, the psychic being, and the central being, developing into something called super mind. And once one is in touch with that super mind, I think one is performing at his or her best. I mean, and that is, I think, the central theme of his philosophy, and it is something which I would say is doable, and it is possible for every human being to achieve the levels which he talked about, moving inwards and touching the core of one's own being, which is the central being, which he called supermind, or in many other Indian philosophical tests, you can call the human spirit or the human soul, or we can call it in multiple names. And I think it's also a great message for our youth also, because we find that the youth, many times they have so much of energy, but they don't know how to channelize it. And I think being in touch with spirituality helps you to channel your this great energy which is available into the right direction, into the right path, which can not only be helpful for a person's own well-being, but also is I would say of great use to the society around in general. And I'm sure that there will be deep discussions about what Shri Aurobindo talked about, and this will really inspire a lot of people, this workshop, especially the students, and also I would say the faculty members who are going to participate in it, to move in the direction and into the path which Shri Aurobindo has shown. So with these few words, I thank you for inviting me, and I wish this 2-day conference and seminar all the very best. And I'm sure that the resource person, the speakers who have been lined up for these 2 days would really bring out the best of Shri Aurobindo's thought. Thank you very much, and best wishes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your encouraging words and insightful remarks, sir. And now I request Dr. SOK sir to propose vote of thanks to the Commissioner, sir. Sir, please unmute yourself.
Once again, good morning, everyone. I deem it my privilege to present a vote of thanks for this inaugural session. At the outset, I extend our warm and heartfelt thanks to our beloved Commissioner, sir, on behalf of the Department of English, SRR Government Arts and Science College, and GDC Jangaon, and all participants for sparing his valuable time and expressing very inspiring remarks. And I also thank the Principal, SRR Government Arts and Science College, and the Principal, GDC Jangaon, and the Convener and Head, Department of English, Uma Madam Garu, and other coordinators and supporters and participants. I wish this 2-day program webinar is going to be a grand success, with the best wishes and blessings from our beloved Commissioner, sir. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you. And the first speaker is also ready, sir, now, Shruti Bidwaikar from Sakar. And now I welcome you, ma'am, for accepting our invitation and being ready for the second session of the seminar. And now I request, before the talk of Shruti madam, I request Maruti sir to present her profile, Shruti madam's profile. Maruti sir, please.
Good morning, ma'am. Am I audible?
No, you are slight, you have to increase your volume.
Okay.
Yes, Maruti sir.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes, sir. Proceed. Proceed, sir.
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, you can proceed. You are audible.
Yeah. Good morning, one and all. and this is Maruti, Assistant Professor of English. It's my immense pleasure to introduce this session's resource person, Madam Shruti Vidwekar. She has had a privilege to have been born in a family which was deeply connected with Sri Aurobindo and the mother. Her moorings were made stronger by her PhD and the period which she spent in Pondicherry listening to various stalwarts in the ashram, society and Sakar, that is Sri Aurobindo Center for Advanced Research and Auroville. Her doctorate thesis was on Sri Aurobindo's poetics and aesthetics. From being a student of Sakar from 2007, she joined work at Sakar as assistant director in 2014 to serve here and grow closer to Sri Aurobindo and the mother. Shruti ma'am is also the assistant editor of the journal New Race, which was blessed by the mother in 1964. And thank you very much for giving me, this opportunity to introduce ma'am. And now I'll hand over the mic to ma'am, Shruti ma'am.
Very good morning to one and all present here.
Yes.
And my deep gratitude. Yes, ma'am, can I start?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, thank you very much. You can
My
start.
deep gratitude to Uma Maheshwari ma'am for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to come and be amongst the English department fraternity, because I've also studied from the English department, Pondicherry University. So I feel I belong to the larger community of English department. And I'm grateful to SRR College, Government Art and Science College, Karimnagar, and ABV Government College. My deep gratitude to the head of the department of both the colleges, Department of English, and the entire English fraternity, because it is wonderful to have so many people come together and on this beautiful occasion of Sri Aurobindo's 150th birth anniversary celebration here. Of course, it is our independence, but before that, as our IS sir just mentioned, it is first Sri Aurobindo's birthday. That was, in fact, it was on his platinum jubilee that India got independence. So this is a gift, as Sri Aurobindo mentioned, that for the work that he had done, Mother India had gifted its independence, her independence, on his own birthday, as if to seal and sanction his his efforts that he has been making towards freeing the country, towards getting independence for the country. So, of course, I will not go further into it. We have sessions on nationalism and other things where other speakers will enlighten us about this topic. My topic that was given to me was Sri Aurobindo, the literature. And it is something to do, as we know, literally with literature or writing or authoring books or writing poems, etc. But when I started digging into it, though I had done some study many years ago, but then when I again sat for it, I realized that the term literature is very small for Sri Aurobindo, because his scope is way beyond, and I'm not talking of the philosophy and the psychology part or the political part that he had written, but even in literature itself, I'm sure the stalwarts of English literature who are sitting here would agree with me that when I present to you the aspects of Sri Aurobindo as a literature, you will say perhaps in the entire history of English poets and authors, we will not find another parallel to Sri Aurobindo. That's my take on it, but you can differ, of course. Now, while I was listening to the introduction to Sri Aurobindo, as was given by a head of the department, ABV College, I was very happy that he mentioned quite a few aspects of Sri Aurobindo. Apart from him being a poet, a nationalist, he did mention about his translations and commentaries, etc. So yes, these are some of the aspects which are not discussed too much in the academic field. Usually, he is considered as the poet of Savitri and a great nationalist. Beyond that, if at all, in Department of Philosophy, he is discussed as a philosopher. But we do miss out on a lot of different aspects, and I have tried to discover quite a few. In fact, if I were to say 14 of his literary facets that I would be presenting here today, So I'll make a small, I'm sharing my screen with you. You can see the small presentation and I will speak along with it. Just give me a moment, I'm sharing my screen. Is my screen visible?
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
Yeah,
it is visible.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So as I mentioned, that we have always overlooked the other facets of Sri Aurobindo, and my aim here in this given time is to put before you the different facets as I've shortly enlisted them here. So I'll go to the first one, of course, the poet. Now, the entire premise of why I brought the aspect of poet first was that all the other aspects find their completion or their reason, or we can say the person is so multifaceted, Sri Aurobindo is so multifaceted because he was a poet, and not a poet, he was a kavi in the right sense of the word, in the ancient sense of the word, that kaviyah satya shrutah and kaviyah satya drishtarah. And there are many different aspects to kavi, but I have only brought two here, shruti and drishti, and trikala drishti being the three faculties that Sri Aurobindo developed during his years of sadhana. So I would only like to defer with the previous speaker who mentioned that his spiritual life began when he came to Pondicherry. In fact, his spiritual life began around the time when he was leaving England. And when in Baroda, he was practicing a lot of things, and we will see some of his writings belong to the Baroda period. And he was acculturating himself into Indian writings, Indian literature, as well as his yoga was going on. And he was working with Maharaja Sayaji Rao Gaikwad there. So this person, now what is important for us to remember is that a poet or a kavi in terms of Sri Aurobindo, or as Sri Aurobindo says, the Vedic rishis had mentioned, kavi has to have these two faculties of shruti and drishti. And that is not just the faculty of seeing or visualizing or hearing, it is the seeing of the truth of the divine word, is the hearing of the truth or the divine sound. So this is the faculty that Sri Aurobindo had already developed by 1914. If you read his record of yoga, he had already developed many of these faculties. Shruti, Drishti, Viveka, Trikala Drishti, Smriti, quite a few different faculties he had developed. And that gave him this power to see poetry. And if we see, when we read Wordsworth or Keats or any other poet, when we read, we get the visionary aspect. We understand, or we see a word picture created by Wordsworth, whether it's of London or of Westminster Bridge or anything that we see, there is a beautiful image that emerges in front of our eyes. And that image is possible because the poet himself has a vision. Now, Sri Aurobindo, being a kavi of that order, of a Mahakavi order, he has a vision of the cosmic world of many universes, etc. Now, I have just brought a small data here, if you can see on the screen, that even as a poet, as a growing poet, so he did not become a kavi on day one. He was a poet interested in poetry, and he read, as Sir mentioned previously, that he was well versed in 12 languages, 12 and more languages, Indian and Western. So he was so good in Greek and French and Latin and German, quite a few European languages, that he started experimenting and writing poetry. And of course, English language was at his, he was very good at that. So he wrote lots and lots of poetry when he was in England itself. So if you go through his collected volumes, and I'm sure some poems are prescribed for the English department, UG and PG students, I counted about 280 poems in English plus 3 in Greek and French, that this collection of collected poems that we call is there, which includes his sonnets, narrative poems, and metrical experiments as well. Now, as also Sir mentioned earlier, that Savitri is the longest complete poem in English language. That also is wonderful, and we will, perhaps time permitting, discuss more about Savitri. And it has been discussed a lot, but it is extremely fascinating to see that Savitri's tenor is wonderfully maintained. Its intensity is wonderfully maintained from the beginning to the end. Whereas at times it happens that even when we write an essay or we write a thesis or we write a poem, the first few lines are extremely inspiring. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. But then the remaining falls off. The remaining doesn't sustain the inspiration. But Savitri is not so. It sustains inspiration from the page line 1 to line last. And that's, of course, Savitri itself is a topic one can go on researching. But I'll move on to another aspect of Sri Aurobindo as a literary giant, I would say, is a dramatist and a playwright. Now, he has to his credit 5 complete plays and 7 incomplete plays. And if you see, his style of writing is quite Elizabethan. He does not write in the prosaic manner. It is not prose poetry that he writes. Prose plays that he writes. I would read out a few lines for you to understand how it is his poetry is Elizabethan and is poetic. This is a dialogue from Perseus the Deliverer, last act, last scene. Fear not, Poseidon, the strong god is free. He has withdrawn from his own darkness and is now his new great self and Olympian height. Cassiopeia. How can the immortal gods and nature change? Perseus. All alters in a world that is the same. Man most must change in who is a soul of time. Is God to change and live in larger light? Cepheus. Then man too may rise to greater heights, is being drawn nearer to the gods? Perseus. Perhaps. But the blind nether forces still have power, and the ascent is slow and long is time. Yet shall truth grow and harmony increase. The day shall come when men feel close and one. Meanwhile, one forward step is something gained. Since little by little earth must open to heaven, till her dim soul awakes into the light. Now, you would have, I do not know if I managed reading it poetically, but it is all written in kind of verses, very rhythmic, very smooth to read, unlike, when we read a prose work. And of course, 2-3 things. When I say Elizabethan, it does not limit Sri Aurobindo by being, the whole essence of it is very Indian. Sometimes it aligns itself to Indian plays like Kalidasian. The way he expresses itself becomes very Indian. Why I may call it Elizabethan is because it's divided into 5 acts and multiple scenes. But we also need to remember when we read Sri Aurobindo's plays or dramas, is that they are not necessarily meant to be staged. Although they have been staged, most of them have been staged. But if we compare it with Bernard Shaw's plays, he has given extensive directions of of the stage design and the stage, how a character is placed on the stage. Sri Aurobindo also has given, but very few. These are more internal dramas. These are the dramas that bring out the soul. There's not much of an external physical action. There is, but limited. Whereas his sole motive was to bring out the soul. So it is not as a drama, as a dramatist per se that he writes. It's more to experiment to see how the soul can be brought out into these plays. And the lines that I just now read from Perseus the Deliverer and the others, if you read Eric or Vasavdatta and other plays, the whole emphasis that Sri Aurobindo has been giving is on seeing the evolution of consciousness. I do not have time to speak about Perseus or Deliverer, but if you read, and you will see there is an evolution of each of the characters, and even the gods evolve towards the end, and that's the dialogue that I just now read. So that's a beautiful contribution. Time and again, I may speak or not about it, but we need to remember that there is always the spiritual dimension, the inner dimension that Sri Aurobindo brings to the table, which sometimes, or many times is not there available for other writers. They're plain social dramas, drawing room dramas, or something having social import. Sri Aurobindo's plays, along with having a social message, or may not have had, has definitely a soul quality, a spiritual inner quality in it. Now, one of the most overlooked aspects of Sri Aurobindo is him being a short story writer. He has written very few stories, one complete story, 4 incomplete stories, and one attempt, I would say, in my understanding, that he perhaps attempted a novel called Door at Abelard, which was incomplete, which was left incomplete. Now, to the students, if students have joined us on this meet, they would be happy to read these. Why I'm saying is that the thrill that we get on the TV these days of the suspense thrillers and the movies and such things, I must say that when Sri Aurobindo has written these, the Phantom Hour or the Door at Abelard or the other stories, they literally give you cold feet. You almost feel that you are in a space which is being haunted by something, or there is some being around us, or there is something going to happen. And I have myself experienced this. So, and these are the occult explorations. So it was not offhand that Sri Aurobindo wrote these short stories. Some were written during his Baroda days, some were written later. But he was again experimenting to see how the occult element, it's not just the fantasy of something not visible or a ghost being there or something, but the occult, the play of the forces which are not visible, how can they be expressed in literature? So that is, again, if I would request Uma ma'am and sir, if stories of Sri Aurobindo have not been incorporated in our syllabus, I would really strongly recommend that they should be, because that's a new, very wonderful facet of Sri Aurobindo that one can discover. Now, next is him being a translator. Now, this is, I do not know how many people have worked on his translations and have explored Sri Aurobindo as a translator, but he has a plethora of writings. In fact, there's a whole volume of about 600 pages, A4 pages, which contain all the translated works of Sri Aurobindo. Apart from that, of course, he has written in Bengali and Sanskrit, and so those works have been translated by others. Now, just to give you an example, since I've highlighted here the theory of translation, I would like to highlight a couple of things, because we also have translation theory paper. I do not know if our colleges have it, but when I was studying, we had this paper called Translation Theory. And we used to struggle, we used to go to those books and try and understand what are these translations, how are they done, what is the source language, how does a person translate, what is this theory? And it is very difficult to pinpoint one theory. We had one book as our Bible where we would be studying it. Now, I would like to here mention that Sri Aurobindo has translated majorly Anandamath of Bankim Chandra, some verses from Kural, Ramayana, Mahabharata, a lot of Bengali poets, poems from his own disciples, poems from Andal or songs from Andal, Bhartrihari's songs and aphorisms, of course, Kalidasa, and Vedic hymns, Upanishadic hymns, Gita, quite a lot of quite a few major works he has translated. Now, regarding Kalidasa, I would like to share a few things with you here. That when he did the translation of Meghadutam, he had actually, that's the one work that he fully had translated. But unfortunately, during his arrest, that was destroyed. In fact, we were told that one of his friends, he found that transcript and he hid it under the soil so that the British does not discover it. But later it was found that when he dug it out, it was half eaten by the white ants. And after that, Sri Aurobindo mentions that it was really a good translation. So Sri Aurobindo would not himself comment anything like that. But he mentions that he lost, that he felt perhaps bad that he lost that translation of Meghadutam, which was fairly well done. But to our benefit or advantage, Sri Aurobindo did write certain explanations based on that. So some verses have come down to us. In fact, there is a whole volume that the ashram has brought out called on Kalidasa, the entire volume on his translations on Kalidasa and the theory essays that he has written on Kalidasa. Now, just a couple of things I would like to point out. Like, say, what is the challenge in front of a translator? And Sri Aurobindo does. He's not blind. He just does not translate for the sake of translating, or just because he loves to translate. There are challenges which he encounters and he overcomes. So I'll read one. To create the same spiritual, emotional, and aesthetic effect as the original, the first condition is obviously to identify our spiritual condition as far as may be with that of the poet at the time when he wrote, and then to embody the emotion in verse. This he's specifically talking about Kalidasa because Meghadutam was written in verse, and it had a spiritual note to it. It had an emotional longing in it. And so he says, what the poet or the translator has tried to recapture is the spiritual, emotional, aesthetic atmosphere of the original times. That is the first difficult challenge and the condition of how we can translate. So tomorrow when we want to translate a work, suppose we are good in 2 languages and we want to translate, this is one of the guidelines that we can keep in mind. Now another one, in fact, he says the purpose of translation could be the translator seeks first to place the mind of the reader in the same spiritual atmosphere as the original. He seeks next to produce in him the same emotions, the same kind of poetical delight and aesthetic gratification. And lastly, he seeks to convey to him the thought of the poet and substance in such words as will create the same or a brilliant train of associations, the same pictures or the same sensuous impressions. Now, we have seen the 3 levels in which one needs to translate. In fact, he has spoken about the way he did translate Kalidasa. Now, one important point for those who are into translation studies or translation, they may like to note is that any work according to Sri Aurobindo cannot be translated just as a transliteration or a linguistic translation or a metaphorical translation or an emotional translation. It cannot be one unidirectional or a unimethodical. One has to adapt quite a few different techniques and methodologies to translate the same text, as was done by Sri Aurobindo while he was translating Kalidasa's Meghadutam. Now, I will cite here a small example that Sri Aurobindo himself brings out. You see, he says that when the figure of Bali, since we are all Indians here, we would know the Titan Bali and the dwarf avatar, the Vaman avatar of Vishnu. The story we are aware as being Indians. So when this appears as when we mention Bali in Sanskrit or in Hindi, the whole connotation, the whole background of Bali comes in front of us. Nobody needs to describe the story to us saying that this was Bali and this was the dwarf avatar and what he did and all that. But how do we, since we are translating in English, Sri Aurobindo was translating in English, how do we convey this? Because in English language, there is no such story. In English language, there is no such concept. And there is a problem of translating such things. So Sri Aurobindo says, to the Indian readers acquainted with the legend of Bali and Vishnu, these are some of my words, I'll bring in Sri Aurobindo in between. A direct reference of these figures in translation would pose no problem. But those unacquainted with Indian mythology or even the story would find it rather out of place to relate to such names. Therefore, Sri Aurobindo translated Vishnu as the highest god and Bali as Titan. Lord Vishnu, taking a dwarf incarnation and measuring the earth and heaven with his 2 feet, quelling Bali with the 3rd measure, is briefly narrated in the translation. I'd read the translation. Dark like the cloudy foot of highest God, when starting from the dwarf-shaped world immense, with Titan quelling step through heaven he strode. Now, this is very beautiful. It fascinates me every time I read, because without giving the names and the history, the story of Bali and Vaman Avatar, Sri Aurobindo has been able to convey the whole imagery of this Titan Bali and this, the steps taken by Vaman, measuring the entire universe. So this is how the English legend is explained in Sanskrit. Now, there is another example which I would like to just cite offhand. Is, Sri Aurobindo says there's a word called crown chair. There's a bird called crown chair in this poem. And he says, now this bird is unaware, the English translator, English reader is unaware of this word. And that too, it's a crying crown chair. Now, how do we convey it? It's just crying doesn't make sense in the poetic formation. So he uses a beautiful phrase called widowed bird. Now you see, widowed bird would speak volumes, a widow and a bird, and so it speaks for itself. So this was almost, you can say, a transliteration or an image juxtaposition, or whatever the literary figure we can call it. So even for translation, Sri Aurobindo has extensively used the literary devices and the figures of speech. Now, we can go on and one can really have a full paper or a thesis done on his work that he has done on translating various works. He has written lots and lots of letters on translation when he was guiding his own disciples about when they translated something, and he said, no, this word in Bengali is not so and so, so this is the right word in English, or this is the image in which you should have translated. So one can really go to Sri Aurobindo's letters on translation and the work on translation and find relevant material there to do some research. Now, a commentator. I do not strictly say that this would come into literary aspect, but I have brought in because Sri Aurobindo has followed this tradition of the ancient acharyas, not deliberately, I must say. All these came offhand, one, because he was learning Indian culture, about Indian culture when he came to Baroda. And so how does one handle, how does one know how much one knows? So when we read, say, if I were to learn Tamil or Telugu literature, and if I were well advanced in it, I would perhaps start translating it or writing my own understanding about it, or start experiencing it if I was spiritually enlightened. So Sri Aurobindo does that. When he was in Baroda, when he was getting acquainted with the Indian culture and the Indian literature, he started translating, commenting, writing essays on them. And so his commentaries on Mahabharata, Ramayana, Kalidasa, Heraclitus, Gita, Vedas, Upanishads, we all have all of them. As a commentator, as one who is experienced, is expert, and is able to give some new insights into these works. For instance, I will share a small, example of why I have brought in literature. Is we know that when we study Mahabharata, if at all we were to study Mahabharata as an Indian text, Indian literature text, the question arises as to, was Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, later on interpolated with Mahabharata? What was the original length of Mahabharata? What was the original length of the Bhagavad Gita? Has it been tampered with? Has Mahabharata been tampered with? So to this, Sri Aurobindo answers that Mahabharata, initially the one written by Maharshi Vedvyas, had a certain length. There were later people or rishis who added some portions to the Mahabharata, but Bhagavad Gita came down as it is without any change in its word or formation or anything. So Bhagavad Gita as it is was written when Mahabharata was being written. It is not that it was later interpolated. The scholars who have studied these works, they argue that the language of Mahabharata and Gita, there are certain differences. There are certain, it seems as if it is written by two different people, or it seems that it is written in two different ages. So these are the arguments that are being given by the commentators or analysts of Bhagavad Gita and Mahabharata. But Sri Aurobindo says you can speak of this about Mahabharata, it's some stories, interpolation, etc. but not of the Bhagavad Gita, because it has come as one mass, as one inspiration to the poet who jotted it down, and it is verbatim truth as it came. And of course, because it was truth given in those 700 verses, it was not a story, it was not a narration the way Mahabharata is. So obviously there has to be a stylistic difference. And Sri Aurobindo confirms this. Sri Aurobindo says that this is the fact. And how we can, in our small understanding, also agree with this is, suppose if we are reading a play or we are writing ourselves a play, we realize that a person who is a kingly person or a princess or a prince, the way they speak, their language is entirely different from when we see a sentry standing at the gate, or a servant, or a comedian, or a clown speaking in the same play. So there is the difference, the tenor is different, the language is different, the words used are different, everything is different. The formation of the word, even if you read Shakespeare, we will see that they are all different. So obviously the need of Mahabharata and the need of Gita were two different things. Similarly, Sri Aurobindo has written commentaries on Heraclitus, the famous philosopher, and his philosophy. He has written about it quite extensively. So these are a few things. I'm bringing on another aspect. That's why I'm not going into Vedas and Upanishads right now. Now, this is a very, very wonderful contribution, as was also mentioned by Sir initially in his introduction, that as a bhashyakar, now we find people giving comments on the Bhagavad Gita. We have Gandhiji, we have Tilak, we have a lot of other people who have written on Bhagavad Gita in the way they wanted to understand it, or as was the need of the time. And that is why what has happened is Bhagavad Gita at one point of time becomes the book of knowledge. At one point of time in history, it becomes the book of works. At one point of history, it becomes a book of bhakti. But Sri Aurobindo, being the master exegete, being the master bhashyakar and the knower of language and the inner, and most importantly behind all this, as I mentioned earlier, his experience of having experienced the Bhagavad Gita absolutely stands there, because he has experienced Gita Yoga by itself, and it was given to him by Sri Krishna himself. So he was a Gita Yogin. He's starting his journey, he was a Gita Yogin. So he knows and by experience Gita through and through. So when he gave the Bhashya, and if you go by the older definition of Bhashyakar, and the person who writes Bhashya is the person who would have experienced that work or a scripture. So when Shankaracharya wrote about the Isha Upanishad or the Gita or other Upanishads, he had experienced in his own manner, he had the experience of those Upanishads. Similarly, other people, say for instance, Swami Dayanand, when he wrote of the Vedas, he had his own experiences of the Vedas, and when he wrote about it, on whichever level he had the experience. Similarly, Sri Aurobindo himself had experienced Vedas even before he read them. He experienced them, and when people recommended him to read, or when he picked up to read Vedas, he realized that this is exactly what my experience has been. This is what I also feel. These are the goddesses that I have seen. These are the images that I have known. So based on his experience, he has given us the Bhashyas, the wonderful volumes of Secret of the Veda, on the Upanishads, on Isha Upanishad. Isha Upanishad by itself is a volume of 600 pages. Then Kena and other Upanishads is a volume of 400 pages, where he has written extensively about these, what could be the concept, what is the meaning of each word, of why this was written at what time. So he has added that wonderful dimension, his experiential dimension, into Vedas, and brought out the real truths of it, which was marred to a large extent by the Western philosophers, Western, I wouldn't call them exegetes, of course, the Western commentators, because a commentary is more on the scholarship level, whereas a bhashya is perhaps based on an experiential level, which Sri Aurobindo was, giving out because of his experience. Moving on, as a linguist, now we all heard that Sri Aurobindo knew 12, 13 languages. But how does it really affect? How does it really affect? Because when we come to Pondicherry, if you happen to visit the ashram, you will see on an average here, every person knows 4 to 6 languages, written or spoken or whatever oral. But ashram children, of course, they know about 4 languages in writing as well as reading. But otherwise also generally sadhaks here or disciples or people coming from outside would end up learning 4 to 6 languages. So how does it make Sri Aurobindo any different? Or how does it add a qualification to Sri Aurobindo? He utilizes these languages in a wonderful manner in his own writings. He brings in, suppose if I were to say, what is the reason of holding this seminar? Now, Sri Aurobindo would say, what is the raison d'etre of this seminar? Now, this is a very small word. He has used it extensively. But what I'm saying is raison d'etre is just not the meaning, just not the purpose. It is much larger word which can be used, which is used in his writings. Similarly, he has used words from Latin and some from Greek, mostly from French, Sanskrit, because he was a linguist, he knew things from Sanskrit. And being a linguist in the linguistic studies, we know that he was very well versed with the philological, morphological, syntactical, semantical, all these nuances he was very, very keenly aware of. And that's why when he uses the language in poetry and other writings, he is very particular, very meticulous in the way he uses them. So since we have not much time, I would have shared some lines with you from Savitri of how he has used the language, particularly in this canto. But however, we'll look into it if time remains. Now, also in his metrical analysis, here I would like to draw your attention to the metrical analysis because Sri Aurobindo has attempted in English language something that was written originally in Greek and Latin or in Sanskrit language. Now, he has drawn from these the metrical lens. In English, generally, we write in the iambic pentameter or in pentameter. We have never experimented, or very little we have experimented on hexameters. And earlier experiments were done. Say Spencer has experimented in that, and other English poets have, but not to that much of a success. So Sri Aurobindo has successfully done it because he stretched the very English language to accommodate a foreign meter. So this I can't explain without any example here, but if you go to his poetry, you will understand the very fact that he had studied Greek and Latin, the very fact that he had studied Sanskrit language, the classical languages of India and Europe, he was able to stretch English language into those metrical parameters. Of course, because he was a linguist, he had the understanding of the sound structures, the phonetic structures, the morphemes. And when he writes Savitri, he is able to conceive, receive, and formulate the mantric vibrations of the sound structures, which are the original sounds of the world, the creation. That again would need some time and analysis. I don't think we have that much scope to do here. So I will move on to the next one. Now, another aspect of a literature is a person who has the science of language. Now, we do study that in semantics, and we have brought it into a very different genre of studying, very technical aspect of studying. But Sri Aurobindo did not leave this saying that I am a literature person, so I will not get into language and philology, etc. So his philological writings, especially in relation to Vedas, have clarified a lot of concepts, misnomers, misconceptions about Vedas. For those students who do not know what a philologist is, philology is the science of the origin of languages. For instance, how and when did Sanskrit and Tamil language they come into existence? They are known to be one of quite a few ancient languages of India, classical languages of India. And then if you see the Sanskrit language of the Vedic times or the Tamil literature of the older ancient times or even Telugu literature of ancient times, the words might be the same, their purport is different, what they want to convey is slightly different, much deeper, and we often misunderstand their words, their purport. For instance, Sri Aurobindo does mention that Agni is used many times in the Vedic literature. Now, when people started interpreting, Indian scholars or Western scholars, when they started interpreting this, Sri Aurobindo reads that it cannot be that at one place Agni is an external fire and at another place it is something else and at another place it is something else. So there has to be some root, some consistency in these, because Vedic rishis were extremely realized people. They were not writing at random. Although we, to our intellectual minds, we will feel there is no connection between verse 1 and verse 2. But there is an internal linking, and that is what Sri Aurobindo has brought out in his wonderful writings on the hymns to the mystic fire based on the Vedic hymns. And he has translated a lot of them. He has spoken about the importance of Agni, Varuna, Mitra, all the gods and many gods and goddesses that are there in the Vedic pantheon. So all this he could do because he based himself on two aspects. One was the psychological aspect and one was the philological aspect. So here also he is employing two parameters, two tools to understand this text. It is not unidirectional understanding. With his spiritual experience, he says, how can I present it to the world, this meaning of the Vedas? He has experienced everything within himself. But to present it to us, one was his psychological aspect. And then he says, I'll read from him, no interpretation of the Veda can be sound which does not rest on a sound and secure philological basis. And yet this scripture, with its obscure and antique tongue, of which it is the sole remaining document, offers unique philological difficulties. To rely entirely on the traditional and often imaginative renderings of the Indian scholars is impossible for any critical mind. Modern philology strives after a more secure and scientific basis, but has not yet found. He further writes, I would urge you to mark his wide reading and knowledge in many different fields related to philology and linguistics. The error of philology, which prevented it from arriving at a more satisfactory result in this direction, was its preoccupation in the physical parts of the speech with the exterior morphology of language and its psychological parts with the equally external connections of formed vocables and of grammatical inflections in kindred languages. But the true method of science is to go back to the origins, the embryology, the elements and more obscure processes of things. From the obvious, only the obvious and superficial results. The profundities of things, their real truth, can best be discovered by penetration into the hidden things that the surface of the phenomena conceals. I skip a few lines. A similar method applied to the earlier forms of human speech can alone give us a real science of language. So he has not only spoken about how he dealt with the Vedas or how Vedas were required to be dealt, but he has even given a new direction to the very wing of philology itself, if one were to study it. What has been philological studies, what modern philology has been doing, and what needs to be done in terms of finding the origin of a language. Now, I move on to an aspect which, again, as I said, has been overlooked. Sri Aurobindo has written essays and essays and essays. In fact, his entire book, one of them is called Essays on the Gita. Another one is called Essays Human and Divine. And his mode of writing mostly has been in essays, though whether we call them philosophical essays or spiritual essays or psychological essays. But I've just brought here a few samples for you to see that the Brain of India, which was written in 4 or 5 consecutive essays, it formed a series. Renaissance in India was a series. On Bankim Tilak Dayanand, each one of the personalities was each independent series. And essays on philosophy and yoga, he has brought in quite a few different aspects of philosophy, psychology, karma, etc., etc. So I'll read out only his to give you a taste of what an essay written by Sri Aurobindo is. And this is from Brain of India, The Brain of India. What was the secret of that gigantic intellectuality, spirituality, and superhuman moral force which we see pulsating in the Ramayana and Mahabharata, in the ancient philosophy, in the supreme poetry, art, and sculpture and architecture of India? What was the basis of the incomparable public works and engineering achievements, the opulent and exquisite industries, the great triumphs of science, scholarship, jurisprudence, logic, metaphysics, the unique social structure? So he is, I've called out this because he's given a series of questions when he's giving us the idea of the brain of India. And then he speaks about it further, he clarifies those. So he is setting an introduction, a premise of what he's going to speak further. Like we do an essay, there's an introduction in an essay. I would leave the essay part here because we can go on and on to understand the very structure of Sri Aurobindo's essays, of what tools he employs in writing an essay. It's not just a general essay as we are given to write in the school, but the whole deeper nuances of an essay. It is also not the essay similar to essays as was written by Lamb or Charles Bacon or other essays, because these are based on some spiritual truths and are again directed towards an inner living and inner longing and a yogic aspect. So they are not just on education. If the essay is written on education, it has deeper implementations, deeper nuances to it. So moving on, a literary critic. Now, I'm sure in the Department of English, you might have incorporated, or some departments I know have incorporated the future poetry or the letters on poetry and have studied Sri Aurobindo's contributions to this particular genre of literature or canon of literature, the literary critical aspect. Now, before I go further and I read something from Sri Aurobindo, I would like to mention here that it would be a very interesting study if one were to make, in fact, one person did write few essays on it, as to what do we find, say, what can we find in Sri Aurobindo in relation to formalism or structuralism or post-structuralism or historical studies or historicism as we call them. So there we have these wonderful, long, big studies of literary criticism, starting from Aristotle till now, what is all going on, post-colonialism, etc., etc. And do we find the strains of these in Sri Aurobindo? Not strains, I would say, how has he incorporated all of them into his works? And we do find the strains. Suppose when he speaks of Shakespeare and his age in the future poetry, he speaks of how Shakespeare was a man by himself, very little actually impacted by what was happening around him. He was, if you were to study, he was an Elizabethan poet, he was a court poet, he was all that external biographical details. But if you go from the formalistic angle also, Sri Aurobindo says, it is possible to study Shakespeare. If you keep aside all his life history, you can still, from a very formalistic angle, study Shakespeare. From a structuralist angle, of course, you can study Shakespeare. So he has given out these nuances of what is the angle with which we can study. It need not be biographical, it need not be historical, it need not be social. It can be purely from the point of view of the vision of the poet. It can be purely from the literary, not devices, I would say, but from the deeper literary taste of poetry itself. So when he speaks about Shakespeare or Marlowe or Wordsworth or Tennyson, he's thorough with it. He knows where he is, he's tracing an evolution of consciousness, evolution of poetry, where Chaucer, just citing an example, Chaucer, he says, is a poet of the physical beauty. So when you read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales especially, you will see that he describes the mannerisms of the nurse or the doctor, all external mannerisms that he's trying to portray. But you need not necessarily go deep within the doctor to understand what his psychology is. But when you read Macbeth, you will perhaps I mean, I'm always taken, into a very different world when I read Macbeth. So there is a different whole world that Shakespeare has created. The philosophy of life that Shakespeare speaks through Macbeth or King Lear or Hamlet or Cleopatra or Shylock or anybody. So these are certain differences that Sri Aurobindo has very beautifully marked out in each of his essays written in this volume called The Future Poetry. And he is not only concerned about the past. Now, if you see the structure of the book, he's not concerned just about what happened in the past from Chaucer to, Tagore or Tennyson or Walt Whitman. He's concerned about what is going to be the future. And he does write what is going to be the future parameters of studying poetry or what poetry would contain in future. And of course, he has exemplified it in many of his sonnets and in Savitri. And of course, Letters on Poetry and Art is again a huge volume that one can study. It includes the letters on Savitri. And one of his letters I would like to read, you can see, and this has a lot of Indian criticism as well. And I'll bring out once I read this. All criticism of poetry is bound to have a strong subjective element in it. And that is the source of the violent differences we find in the appreciation of any given author by equally eminent critics. All is relative here, art and beauty also, and our view of things and our appreciation of them on the consciousness which views and appreciates. You see, we have been debating about the subjective aspect of poetry, understanding text and literature, etc. So he has very emphatically given us a clearer answer. In another letter, he mentions that art has to be suggestive. Any art, whether it's visual art or it's poetry or literature, it has to be suggestive. And this is so important, and it comes close to what Acharya Abhinav Gupta had mentioned in his, treatise on aesthetics, that suggestion is the hallmark, is the cornerstone of literary criticism. So you see, Sri Aurobindo is an ocean which has synthesized in himself not just Aristotle, but Abhinav Gupta, but Natya Shastra, but so he is that ocean where all the Ganges flow. And in his future poetry, you will see when he talks about mantra, when he talks about sphota, when he talks about vak, we are almost thrown into a whole spell into thinking whether he's Indian, he's taking the Indian English literary criticism forward or he's taking the Western forward. But at the end of the day, he has synthesized all, and he's taking the very future poetry he's exemplifying in front of us. Moving on to the next aspect is as a literary critic, art critic. Now, this, one may say that it belongs to the artistic thing, and it is not something that we need to do with literature per se. But when we talk about the literary aspect, you will see the way he has written his essays on foundations of Indian culture or Renaissance in India and essays on national value of art. A whole new way of explaining and criticism comes in. That this is where I have brought it into literature, literature, is that for him, art is not different from life or literature. For him, we are studying this to understand our own culture, our own psyche, our own civilization. I'll read a few lines and then we will try to understand. All art reposes on some unity, and all its details, whether few and sparing or lavish and crowded and full, must go back to that unity and help its significance. Otherwise, it is not art. Now, there was a criticism made by an English writer, William Archer, and he says that Indian art, if the photograph that I've brought in here and another one I'll show you, you can see the depth of each of these things. From bottom to the top, you will see that there are carvings, and this is all granite. So carvings and carvings and carvings on the very smallest piece of rock there. So it was objected by the Western critic that India leaves no spaces like you have in Japanese art. So it keeps on crowding and crowding and crowding. But Sri Aurobindo says there is a unity in this crowding. It is not random. It is not that one person is making something else and the other person is making something else and there's no harmony between what is being made. If you actually visit this, in fact, I recently visited this Tanjore temple. Though if you even in this facade, you will see the bottom panel here, all the gods and goddesses are not, it's not a replication of left to the right and right to the left, but there is a beautiful synchronicity, a beautiful harmony. And that is what Sri Aurobindo speaks about. And I would really say, I would recommend the Department of English to read some of these essays of Sri Aurobindo on art and literature. He has written on literature also in this volume, because it will give us a wonderful way of criticism. Criticism need not be negative. Criticism need not be always saying no to the other person or negating the other person. It can be a healthy criticism. Of course, Sri Aurobindo has taken up the arguments given by William Archer, but he has shown how they are adequate or inadequate and how they were actually quite hostile at times. So one can use this as a piece of literary criticism or a piece of criticism. Moving on to the last couple of them is journalistic writing. And though I brought some samples here, I'll not read all of them, maybe just one, because it will be very inspiring for all of us. Journalism, of course, has become another mass communication field, and again we can argue that it is not the field of literature, but earlier it was. And we do like to learn from how a journalist writes, very crisp, very to the point, making an impact, leaving a message. So this is what Sri Aurobindo does. I'll read a few lines here. So with India rests the future of the world. Whenever she is aroused from her sleep, she gives forth some wonderful shining ray of light to the world, which is enough to illumine the nations. Others live for centuries on what is to her the thought of a moment. God gave to her the book of ancient wisdom and bade her keep it sealed in her heart until the time should come for it to be opened. Such sentences have been the inspiration of the ages and fed humanity for many hundreds of years. So too, when India sleeps, materialism grows apace and light is covered up in darkness. But when materialism thinks herself about to triumph, lo and behold, a light rushes out from the east, and where is materialism? Returned to her native night. The entire thing that I shared is a small, very small piece and a complete piece by itself, but it's extremely targeted. It's very impactful. And I've been reading these almost last 15 years, I've been reading these lines over and over and over again. And I don't get tired getting charmed by the impact that it creates on us. The last two aspects of Sri Aurobindo, the letters that he wrote. Now we have something in literature called the epistolary novels or the epistolary writings. So of course, Sri Aurobindo has not written a novel based on letters, but it is his wonderful contribution of when he writes more than 10 volumes of letters. Some have formed a part of his collected volumes, complete volumes, 4 volumes. But to other disciples, say like one person called Dilip Kumar Roy, he has written about 10 volumes of letters to himself. I mean, to Dilip Kumar Roy himself, Sri Aurobindo has written about 10 volumes. So he was only constantly writing letters, clarifying doubts, attending to the complaints of the people. And one small, how he guided people through his letters. Somebody might have asked him about meditation. So he responds, what do you call meditation? Shutting the eyes and concentrating? It is only one method for calling down the true consciousness. To join with the true consciousness or feel its descent is the only thing important, and if it comes without the orthodox method, as it always did with me, so much the better. Meditation is only a means or device. The true movement is when even walking, working, or speaking, one is still in sadhana. So of course, this speaks about himself and his letters, but he has written On every smallest, if a sadhak says, I had this kind of a dream, what does it mean? So he has taken pains to write and respond to him. One of the last major aspects of Sri Aurobindo is his being in a forest. Not only that he has written aphorisms, here you can see on the screen there are a couple of aphorisms that I have brought, but he has written something called The Mother, a very, very small book of about 20 pages, you can say in A4 size, and that it reminds us of Bacon, but it takes us beyond Bacon. So if you remember in Bacon, he writes about off studies, and he says the opening sentence, reading maketh a perfect man. Or maybe not the first sentence, but he does mention. So I was always hit by this. I said, wow, what a perfect sentence. And you can go on writing essays on it. Similarly, I have brought here this small sentence from The Mother, the book that Sri Aurobindo has written, the booklet that he has mentioned. I'll read it here. There are two powers that alone can effect in their conjunction the great and difficult thing, which is the aim of our endeavor, a fixed and unfailing aspiration that calls from below, and a supreme grace from above that answers. This I call for myself, I feel this is an aphoristic writing. Such packed, meaning is packed in these 20, 30 pages that he has written. Each of these essays, and 6 essays are there in these 20 pages, on every, not even 20 pages, I would say. And each essay is just 1.5, 2 pages max. But he has given out the mantras or the formulas of doing sadhana in these 20 lines. So this is us in stylistically seeing, I find it aphoristic. Stylistically seeing, I find it mantric, because mantra is the future, poetry is the future, literature is the future, where poetry and art and text is going, should be going, according to Sri Aurobindo. And here I've heard that a few sadhaks are trying to analyze the meter of this book. There is a metrical rhythm into this book. As I mentioned earlier, there was a meter in the plays or the dramas that Sri Aurobindo has written. He also has experimented here. His prose is metrical. If you have heard of Brahmanas, which are one of the portions of the Vedas, the Brahmanas are written in prose, but they are metrical, but they are rhythmic. Similarly, this The Mother also is written in prose, but it's rhythmic. It has an internal, beautiful rhythm to itself. And it is, of course, left to a scholar who wants to read it from this point of view of language and its structure, etc. A couple of things which I did not bring in on the screen here is his automatic writings. Because Sri Aurobindo was one whose automatic writings, I do not want to call them automatic writings, but there are 2 volumes of his record of yoga, where he recorded his own yoga. And it was, for people who are trying to read Sri Aurobindo, it is like hieroglyphs, because we do not understand what he has written. But he has written in small notes and notations for himself. So sometimes it can be an inspiration for people like us who sometimes have an experience, how scientifically he has jotted down everything that he does, he has done in his experimenting, in his sadhana. So it's not just that he scaled a consciousness and he went up there and he has not written down anything. In fact, he wrote that today there was a success, today there was a failure. I've experienced this, I've experienced the calm, or I've experienced the disturbance. He was a very, very honest journal writer, or a person who would take down notes. These days it is called journal writing. So we have these wonderful various aspects, and I'm sure I've left out a couple of them. But to recapitulate quickly, Sri Aurobindo, the multifaceted genius, Sri Aurobindo, the Mahakavi, and because he was a Mahakavi, a Mahayogi, he was a poet, a dramatist, a short story writer, a translator, a commentator, a bhashyakar, a linguist, a philologist, an essayist, literary critic, art critic, a journalist, I wouldn't say having journalistic writings, a letter writer, and a forest, and much more. So with this, I have tried to just give you an overview of what I have understood in Sri Aurobindo's literary gamut, and there is much to explore, and each of these can really have many, many theses. And I would urge the Department of English of both the colleges to encourage this kind of a pinpointed study on Sri Aurobindo's works, because these days there's a trend that even to me when I was doing my PhD, the trend was our professors would ask us, okay, you choose a theory, okay, I'm doing on feminism, and I have to apply feminism onto the 5 novels that I'm studying. And I just did not quite like it, because feminism by itself is a very Western concept. If you study an Indian concept, the idea of feminism is entirely different. If you read Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, it will be even more elevated and different. So applying a Western concept to an Indian novel or an Indian scenario, or even to a Western one, it's just an application. If you study the text by itself, say Sri Aurobindo Savitri or poems, so there will be an intertextuality in his own texts, and we will get guidance from his own texts. So there's much that literary department can, in fact, I feel amongst all the other departments that can adapt from Sri Aurobindo, literature or English literature department has the maximum to gain and the maximum to explore. So I really implore both the departments, the head of the departments of both the colleges, to take up some projects, small assignments or big thesis, to explore these aspects of Sri Aurobindo's literary works. Thank you for giving me this opportunity once again, and I'm grateful to you.
Thank you, madam. It's a comprehensive talk. It's a really wonderful one, touching upon all the aspects of this multifaceted genius. And now I open this platform for the interaction. Students who are there, PG students who are there, please, you can ask your doubts if you have any.
Ma'am, do you have Sri Aurobindo's text in your syllabus?
Not now, madam. It used to be there, but we don't have it now. Yes, any one of you, please give your feedback or any doubts if you have, even the teaching faculty. Yes, please. PG students, are you there?
Hello?
Yes, sir.
Can you hear me, ma'am?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, can you give some insights into Savitri, ma'am? Because we had this poem somewhere in when we were doing this MA first year. I suppose, of course, it is not there now in the syllabus. So, what was the intention of writing Savitri exactly? Actually, this is I mean, this Savitri, we know about Savitri in general sense, but his intention was quite different, I think. And of course, we had only only Canto 1, I think, when we were doing this PG. So, what was the real intention of writing this Savitri, ma'am?
A couple of things that I can think about Savitri. One is Sri Aurobindo's intention, as he specifically mentions, is to see how far poetry can reflect the ascension of consciousness. For this, and I will just cite a small example, is suppose I am in a deep sorrow and I happen to write poetry in that state of my mind or consciousness. I would write a poetry which is sorrowful, which will reflect my state of being sorrowful. So when I'm very happy, I have seen a beautiful rising sun, or I've met an old friend, or something that makes me very happy in life, and I'm able to write poetry, it again will reflect that joyful state of mind. So we can see in our own lives that whether it's anger, love, jealousy, passion, anything that we experience is reflected in poetry. So now what Sri Aurobindo was experimenting with is, as he was rising in his consciousness year after year, he was rising the scales of his consciousness. He wanted to see, is it being reflected in my poetry or not? It was for himself first. He did not make it public for the longest time. He said, I want to see, suppose, just for instance, this is not written anywhere, but suppose he was on an illumined state of mind, if you are aware of the levels of mind that Sri Aurobindo has scaled and he has spoken about. So he has, suppose in 1 year he has scaled to the illumined mind and he has stationed himself. And what is noteworthy here is, unlike we normal human beings who rise to a certain level during our meditative state, we come down immediately. For us, food, going to the market, attending to the job and the family, that becomes important. So as I just read a letter here that we do not remain in that meditative state while eating, walking, sleeping, working. We are not in that. Unless those 10 minutes of meditation is the only meditation we can do. Whereas for Sri Aurobindo, he was into that consciousness constantly 24/7. And that's why he was trying to rise. So suppose he was stationed on an illumined level mind. He was, trying to bring down poetry. Now here we have to remember that he was not writing with his mind.